for that introduction. Like you said, my name is Alyssa Essman. I'm the State Extension Specialist for Weed Science, and today we'll be reviewing some of the information in terms of the weeds that are most common and problematic as a result of some of the survey work we continue to do. We'll talk a little bit about the new product offerings for this year, as well as some new additions to the weed control guide. We'll walk through resistance considerations, as well as some of those regulatory and labeling changes that we have sort of in the pipeline that we expect to continue to influence how we use herbicides going into the future. So you might be familiar with what we call our pre-harvest survey. So in this, we drive around at the end of the season just before harvest, and we evaluate soybean fields across the state to get a sense of the frequency and distribution of different weed species. And this gives us kind of an idea of how well our herbicide programs worked that growing season, and also kind of forecast potential issues in the upcoming growing season based on those plants left in the field late season and the seed that's likely going to go back into the seed bank. And so here we have the data from our 2024 pre-harvest survey. Somewhat unsurprisingly, but definitely concerning, water hemp was our #1 most common weed in our survey this year. We found it in about 11% of the fields that we encountered, and we'll look at the distribution on a map here on the next slide. Shortly after that, a close second was giant ragweed, one of those species that continues to be a problem, just a really difficult one to manage for a couple different reasons, and we'll talk about that as well. And then we have these next 3 species, our grass and foxtails, volunteer corn, and mare's tail, that kind of round out those top 5 in terms of the species that are most common in soybean at the end of the growing season. I believe we surveyed about 4,100 fields last year, and about 62% of those fields were clean or at least free of those 10 weed species that we evaluate on that survey. So here we have our distribution map for 2024 showing the percent of fields with water hemp. The darker the pink or red color, the greater proportion of fields that we encountered had water hemp at the end of the season. So as you can see in the 22 and 23 numbers, it's been pretty close to the top of the list in the past couple years, but this was the first year that it was our most common weed species. I did want to point out here, there's a couple counties in white, which if you look at the legend, it says 0% of fields. Just to clarify, that doesn't mean that water hemp is not in that county. It very likely is. We just didn't encounter it randomly on our survey. So based on the results of this survey, as well as working with growers over the years and within our research program, we continue to spread the message about these species that we call the Big 5, right? These are the most troublesome weeds we have that we really deal with in our corn and soybean systems, as well as several of those that we saw being the most common. So sort of at the top here, right, we have these species that we're pretty familiar with in Ohio: giant ragweed, common ragweed. You might have more or less of one of these species depending on where you're at in the state. Common ragweed, we tend to see more in the northern portions of the state. Giant ragweed tends to be more central and southern Ohio. Mare's tail, one of those that came in and is really tricky, especially in situations where we maybe don't have a fall application in rotation, or we have a no-till operation. And then we have these 2 somewhat newer species to Ohio relative to those others, but those that are, as we've seen, really increasing in prevalence and going to be kind of the face of what's driving a lot of our herbicide programs as we continue to see it spread across the state and we talk about some of the resistance issues. And so, of course, we're talking about water hemp as well as a closely related species, Palmer amaranth. So if we look at this list of confirmed cases of resistance in Ohio, we see that all of these species that we talked about being some of the most common, certainly some of the most troublesome, are also those that have the most complex and diverse herbicide resistance profiles. And if we break it down further, this table illustrates some of that resistance that is likely to exist within our water hemp population, right? More or less, we know some of the resistance issues we have within our mare's tail and ragweed populations, those being largely resistant to our group 2 and 9 herbicides. Common ragweed picks up some PPO resistance in certain parts of the state, right? But our water hemp, we've been screening as part of our pre-harvest survey, right? So at that time, if we encounter a field that has a pattern of resistance, meaning it's somewhat of a monoculture, right? It's not a particularly messy field with several other species. There's no sort of pattern of any sort of spray miss or drowned out areas. It's sort of this monoculture of water hemp and a suspicious pattern that we suspect resistance. And as part of this project, right, we collect that seed, we bring it back to the greenhouse. We screen for a certain portion of herbicides. We've also been sending off another portion of these seeds to be screened for group 4 and 10 resistance. And so this table sort of illustrates some of these preliminary findings that we're still working through on several of these populations in the greenhouse. And we can see that essentially each of our effective options for control of water hemp in our corn and soybean, we've detected some level of resistance in at least a couple of these. And this is not, overwhelmingly surprising based on the nature of this weed, and we'll talk about some of those characteristics and why it develops resistance so quickly, and also what we've seen in other states nearby. And we know what's really concerning about this, of course, aside from the efficacy of some of our post options, are these pre-emergence herbicides that we rely a lot on for extended control in our corn and soybean systems. So for this next section here, we'll talk about some of these new products. Companies continue to bring to market premixes that put together different active ingredients as well as new formulations of products. And so we have a couple new products for this upcoming growing season, as well as 4 products that aren't necessarily new, but they have been added to the weed control guide. So we provide some refreshers and some reminders for those products as well. So this first product is one of those new products for this growing season. This is Inversa from Corteva. It's an encapsulated acetochlor product. So same active ingredient as you would find in Warrant. It is a group 15. Being similar to Warrant, we would expect residual control of our annual grasses, as well as some small-seeded broadleaves like pigweeds and lamb's quarters. But because of this encapsulation formulation, has improved crop safety relative to some other formulations. And so Inversa can be applied to soybean pre-plant up to the R2 growth stage. The second new product then for this growing season is Zalo from AMVAC. This is a premix of quizalofop, or an Assure 2-type product, a group 1, as well as glufosinate, a group 10. So this provides control of emerged grass and broadleaf weeds in our glufosinate-resistant soybean. We've had this in our trials, and based on this active ingredients, not too surprising. Just want to point out that it does tend to miss yellow foxtail and barnyard grass in particular. So if you do have those species, I might want to consider another option for control of those. Additionally, because of the makeup of this product, it will not control enlist corn in a volunteer situation. And so Zalo can be applied up to the R1 growth stage or 80 days before harvest. These next 4 products then again aren't new, but they were added to the weed control guide this year, so we're just providing a reminder here. So Cheetah Max from New Farm is a premix of Famecifin, or a Flexstar product with glufosinate. This provides control of emerged weeds with some of that residual activity in soybean. We might expect some minor improvement in water hemp control relative to the use of glufosinate alone. Can be applied pre-plant or pre-emergence, pretty much in any soybean system, or post and glufosinate resistance soybean from emergence up to, but not through R1. Tribal from Loveland, this is a premix of S-metolachlor or similar active that we'd find in Dual, a group 15, as well as metribuzin and sulfentrazone. This is for pre-plant or pre-emergence residual control in soybean, and more targeting species like annual grasses, as well as, again, small-seeded broadleaves like pigweeds, lamb quarters, and nightshade. Because of the components of this product, not something we want to use on our sandier soils or those with high pH or low organic matter. Trypsin ZC, this is a UPL product, a premix of pendimethalin or a PROW with metribuzin. This will provide some control of annual grasses and certain broadleaf weeds like lamb's quarters, our pigweeds, and smartweed. This should be applied before planting, before weed and crop emergence, or post up to 30-inch tall field corn, or in the VA growth stage. This is a field corn product, so not for our seed corn, sweet corn, or other types of corn, and really not for field corn in situations where it's stressed from things like weather, diseases, or fertility. The last product that's been added to the guide for this year is a Duracor from Corteva. This is actually a grass pasture product, a mix of 2 group 4s, which will then target our broadleaf and woody plants and grass pastures. Can be applied 15 to 20 days prior to planting some of those tolerant grass species. And we can have post applications in our tall fescue, orchard grass, timothy, and annual ryegrass after we have 3 true leaves. So we'll provide some more reminders about water hemp for this growing season, right? It is one of those weeds, like we've talked about, that's continuing to spread across the state. We'll continue to drive some of our herbicide programs, and we'll provide some reminders on the biology and the characteristics that make it problematic to deal with, as well as some of those control strategies that we recommend. So if you're familiar with water hemp, you probably know or have heard about, right? Part of the problem with managing this weed is that it has really immense seed production. Based on the competitiveness of the situation that it's in, can produce anywhere from 100,000 to over 1 million seeds per plant. Part of the reason why we're so concerned about seeing this plant in field at the end of the season, because we know the level and the amount of seed that can be contributed back to the seed bank just from having a few plants in the field at that time. Has a really fast growth rate, inch and a half a day. That means, in some of the unpredictable, inclement spring weather that we've talked about being an increasing trend throughout the program, today, just a couple days, and this is because of that inclement weather, not being able to get into the field and get it sprayed timely, is really problematic for post-emergence control, knowing that the more growing points this plant's put on, the harder it is to get killed. It has a really long emergence window, something we also talk about for another species. Giant ragweed can have sort of this, prolonged window, but it presents a little differently. So whereas giant ragweed comes up earlier in the season and then will drop off sort of mid to late summer, water hemp actually starts to emerge a bit later into the growing season, but will continue to emerge up to and through late summer and fall, right? So it's a really long period of time that we have to consider the management of water hemp. And part of the reason why we have this, sort of layered residual approach and really shapes how we manage it relative to some of our other species. It's really highly genetically diverse. This is a dioecious species, and that just means the male and female plants are separate, right? So they have to outcross to reproduce, and you're essentially doubling the genetic pool that you're taking from to generate the offspring of water hemp. And that kind of influences management in a couple ways. One is that it can make identification of water hemp really difficult. If you have water hemp in your field, you probably know that it's got quite a range of the characteristics it can present. So it can have a really dark red stem, can have a bright pink stem, dark green stem, light green stem, right? And it could be really easy to think, maybe we have a number of different species in the field because of this difference in characteristics. And the other really problematic thing here is that really high genetic diversity means it also develops herbicide resistance a lot more rapidly, right? We have a really high genetic diversity along with high seed production. That's a good chance that one of those offspring in any given year, has the characteristics needed to be able to metabolize or survive an herbicide application. And if we're applying our herbicides of similar sites of action multiple times a year over many years, right, that intense selection pressure means that a larger and larger proportion of that population will have that resistance trait until we can no longer really control it at the population level, right? And this means, of course, herbicide resistance, like we've looked at in our water hemp populations in particular, are a real problem and will likely influence what options we have for control in any situation. In terms of our control recommendations, especially for this weed, right, we mentioned problems with height and getting them controlled with some of those post products if we're not super timely. And that's part of the reason why we really stress the importance of a really robust, comprehensive residual program, right? Especially in some of these dense populations. If we have really high populations and we're trying to get those controlled post, it's just not a good strategy. So anything we can do to reduce the population and reduce the size potentially at the time of a post will give us the best chance of success. So some of the better options here are pyroxasulfone, right? Or a Zidua product, or a flumioxazine or sulfentrazone, or things like metolachlor, Indule, or metribuzin. And then some products with some efficacy, those being acetochlor and dimethanamide. And so something we'll talk about a little later in this presentation is kind of the utility of metribuzin in this situation and how it can really provide value as a tank mix factor. One thing that comes up when we talk about water hemp and we look at the resistance profile, right, is how much we rely on our group 15s for management of water hemp and soybean. And so one strategy that folks can consider is, incorporating those group 15s or group 14s and 5s up front and really saving the group 15 as our post strategy. So when we look at our effective post options in our traded soybean systems and the Liberty Link system, right, our option is a glufosinate post with an effective residual. In our XtendFlex systems, we don't have dicamba as an option for this growing season. We'll talk about that later in this presentation. So glufosinate, and again, an effective residual is our option there. In the Enlist system, and really what we've seen to be kind of the more effective option for water hemp control post is the combination of 2,4-D and glufosinate. And again, including this residual within that application. Right, we talked about the length of emergence that we see throughout the growing season with water hemp, especially relative to some of the other species that we're more used to dealing with. When we have this really long emergence pattern, especially for a weed that emerges later, right, as soon as we make our application, we've set the clock in terms of efficacy. So we make our application, we have an effective concentration of that residual in the soil, and as it's exposed to, moisture and heat and microbes, it will decline in concentration in the soil until it reaches a level where we no longer have an effective concentration. We start to see water hemp break through. So applying, again, an effective residual in our post-application bumps the concentration of an effective product in the soil back up to a level to where we can extend that period of control later into the growing season until our crop plants can get some real size and really be competitive with our water hemp populations. When it comes to our residual options post, some of the work we've done, as well as numerous states across the Midwest, have shown that in terms of efficacy, which for a residual product largely means length of control, sort of that top product in many instances is a pyroxasulfone product, right? So the Zidua that we talked about. Other effective products are, again, the esmetolochlor or a dual option, or acetochlor with emesifen. And among the lesser effective options are acetochlor or dimethanamide alone. Part of what makes water hemp sort of frustrating to manage is that even in the most diligent programs, right, being as timely as we can, appropriate product selection, really good applications, based on the nature of this weed, the resistance profiles, the prolific nature, the long germination pattern, it's really likely that we're going to have some escapes at the end of the season. And so for that reason, scouting our fields, getting out and looking sort of below the crop canopy, and seeing what we've got and being able to identify water hemp are really good strategies to help us get ahead of this weed. Along the same lines, if we have those plants in the fields toward the end of the season, removing them before they set seed, right, and contributing a really large amount of seed back into the seed soil bank is the best way for us to get ahead of the problem for the following growing season. Part of why this works so well, and thinking really for this species in particular, how we manage water hemp, and we're so concerned about not including or not allowing those seeds to go back into the seed bank, is because relative to some other species, something like lamb's quarters, where the seeds can live decades in our soil system, water hemp seed viability is pretty short. Meaning after 3 to 5 years of being in the soil ecosystem, mortality really increases and we see a drop in viability. That means if we're really diligent about the management of water hemp over a period of about 3 to 5 years, we can really get ahead of it and drive down our seed bank and reduce the population that we have to contend with year after year. Sort of next on that list of species that we've talked about, and we saw again as a problem in our survey this year, and the county educator survey actually found this as their #1 most common weed in 2024, is actually volunteer corn. Likely due to the fact, right, that we have these resistance traits in corn that make it pretty hard to clean up in our soybean systems. So we want to control these plants like any weed when they're smaller. So at the time of the first post, a grass herbicide is a really good strategy for volunteer corn and soybean, knowing we might have some antagonism if we are tank mixing that with one of our Group 4 products. In our Roundup Ready and Liberty Link corn, of course, glyphosate and glufosinate are going to be effective options. And in our Enlist corn, one of those categories of our Group 1 products, the FOP herbicides are also going to be ineffective. And so when they introduced the resistance trait to 2,4-D, that chemical handle was actually very similar to the FOP herbicide, which conferred resistance, meaning we can actually apply Assure within our Enlist corn system, but it also means we cannot rely on those as a post option where Enlist corn is in a volunteer situation. So for those instances, we want to use a DIM herbicide, something like clethodim and Select Max. We do want to mention again this year, of course, listening to Aaron talk about kind of what several parts of the state went through last year. And one of those considerations is this weather component and how we think about the management of weeds when we have these really drought-stricken or heat-stressed situations. One of the concerns is with herbicide breakdown, right? A lot of that is driven by microbial degradation, which really relies on moisture and heat, right, for those microbes to be active to break down the herbicide. In the lack of moisture, we have a situation where we might have more carryover concerns. One of the trends right now that we'll talk about the reasoning behind here in a second, but several companies are kind of going away from atrazine as part of these premix corn products, right? And that means we're relying a lot on things like mesotrione and clopyralid to provide some control in those systems. So those are products where we have that special concern about carryover, especially if we're playing late in the season, if we have sort of split applications or where we're using really high rates. Another question that comes up is this lack of soil-applied herbicide activation and concerns about residual use, knowing that we have to have those residual components in the soil solution to be active. Really depends on the product in question, right? Some of them require more or less water for optimal activity. That being said, in our trials and trials in the states west of us, where they do have maybe less rainfall than we normally do, we tend to still see differences in our treatments where we've had a residual product compared to where we haven't. Other concerns include delayed or erratic emergence patterns and whether or not, we should wait for rainfall and that flush of weeds to spray or to go ahead and get them now. And I guess one line of thought to consider here is that weeds really are most easily controlled when they're small and before they've lived through any sort of really stressful weather event, they're get kind of hardened off. So if we do go ahead and spray, we're going to have potentially more effective control than if those weeds get some size and they do get hardened off and kind of change, the physiology of those plants. One way in which they do that is when exposed to, hot or dry conditions, they increase their cuticle thickness, right? So that waxy layer on the leaf surface gets thicker and it's harder to get, especially our water-based products, into our weed plants. And so those situations where we have those types of weeds, our spray adjuvant packages become especially important. And we want to prioritize really getting great coverage and absorption of those products. Okay. So we've got about 15 minutes here, and I really want to cover the Endangered Species Act and the EPA's herbicide strategy and how that's going to influence herbicide labeling in the coming years. So the Endangered Species Act is not new, right? This was passed by Congress in 1973, and the idea behind it is to protect endangered species and their habitats. Why we're talking about it now is that more recently, the EPA has been under fire for not meeting the obligations outlined in the Endangered Species Act. As a result, in April 2022, EPA released their ESA work plan as an effort to address this issue. They followed that with a draft herbicide strategy in July 23. And this is just one part of that work plan, right? But what it means for us is it really outlined the EPA's plan for mitigating off-target herbicide movement, specifically drift, runoff, and erosion. And more recently, the final strategy was released and put into place in August 2024. There's a number of involved parties with various roles throughout this process. The EPA and USDA are those entities that evaluate herbicide risk to the endangered species in their habitat and process the herbicide registration. Herbicide companies, of course, apply for the herbicide registration. It's Fish and Wildlife Services and NOAA that work with experts to identify and list endangered species habitats and their users. And the role of herbicide users here is to be aware of and follow those label requirements for application. And so I've included a couple maps to kind of give us a sense of those endangered species that are in Ohio and where they exist. And so there's a couple resources if you're interested in this sort of information. ODNR put out this document in September 2024. You can find it at the QR code here. And it talks about, the number of species and major classifications. When we look at this, right, we look at the endangered species and the types of species within those. Something I guess that catches my eye are the number of fishes and mollusks in those, right? In Ohio, in total, we have about 132 different species classified as endangered, and having quite a few in those aquatic regions, we might expect some regulations specifically in those areas. If we want a more defined look at this, ODOT has a document of known ranges of these federally listed species in Ohio that was updated August 24. So this map we see here, and there's different charts, again, at this QR coded document. But this map really highlights in each county, based on different color-coded icons, what species are within those counties, right? And you can see on the right here in the legend, the number and list of endangered species, different mussels, birds, etc. And then, you can find your county and identify which species or icons are within there. Also within this document that's helpful is a little bit more granular look at the species and where they actually exist. So you can see on the table to the left here, we have the species, their habitat, as well as the specific streams and in what counties those streams take place, right? So for example, the club shell, what habitat it's in, and then some of the streams, those being, Big Darby Creek, Fish Creek, Little Darby Creek, etc. So what this herbicide strategy does is it really outlines the EPA's plan for reducing off-target movement and mitigating the risk to endangered species. And they do this through what they're calling different mitigation strategies, right? And these are really broken down to the different types of off-target movement, those being, spray drift and runoff and erosion. So for spray drift, this likely relies on the use of buffers. The size of these buffers will depend on our application equipment, droplet size, the anticipated level of species impact. The size can potentially be reduced through the use of hooded sprayers or windbreaks. Sometimes the label will require, a maximum wind speed and spray height, and buffers in the forms of areas like fields, field borders, and roads. Runoff and erosion is a little bit more complex. There's different mitigation categories, some of which we can control, things like field management, some of which we can't control quite as well, those being field characteristics, and we'll look at some examples of those. Strategies are assigned a value that's specific to the chemical, crop, and species in question. The more effective a strategy is said to be, the higher the point value it will get. A certain number of points will be required to meet label requirements for an herbicide if it has been found to have a risk of runoff and erosion. Examples of strategies on this mitigation menu are things like grass waterways and cover crops. Again, those things we can implement, as well as some field characteristics like slope. There's a potential exemption from these mitigation strategies if the grower's field is more than 1,000 feet from the species habitat, or there is a field site-specific management plan from some sort of conservation program or expert. One important point here is that when looking for information on these mitigation strategies, when they will be required anywhere the herbicide is applied across the entire U.S., those measures will be listed on the herbicide label. Where they were required on only parts of the U.S., based on where certain endangered species exist, they'll be listed on the EPA's Bulletins Live 2 system, right? And we'll look at that system and sort of how it works and its functionality. The link here will take you to the EPA website that really walks you through all the different mitigation strategies, their associated point values, and some of their definitions. Also want to point out at the end, I will have a QR code for our website. On that website, under the Resources tab, I have included a link called the Endangered Species Act, and all of these links are listed there on our website. Another important point here is that this is a very evolving process, right? So this herbicide strategy has been approved, but herbicides largely won't be affected until they go through the EPA registration review process. It's at that time that these products will receive their mitigation strategy requirements. Any new active ingredients would undergo biological evaluations and get mitigation strategies during that process. And actually, the first new label was released following these guidelines in October 2024, and that was Liberty Ultra. This is a new BASF product. It's glufosinate P-ammonium with the GluL technology. Essentially, what that does is it allows for a reduced rate of Liberty Ultra relative to generic glufosinate. On this label are some pretty good examples of what we might expect in terms of labeling, where strategies are required across the whole U.S., as well as those specific to certain regions. So on the label, we see here there is a section that specifically points out the endangered species and threatened species protection requirements and how we need to go to this Bulletin's Live 2 system to ensure compliance. But if we look at the label just above that, we see some of those requirements that are required, again, across the whole U.S. Those being wind speed and direction must be measured on location. Sustained wind speed must be between 3 and 5 miles per hour, measured at the release height or higher in an area free of obstructions. There is a mandatory 10-foot downward spray buffer for ground applications, but that can be reduced to 0 if we're using a drift-reducing adjuvant, a hooded sprayer, or we have a windbreak or shelter belt present. For this product, 3 runoff mitigation points are required. And if we look at, again, that list of mitigation strategies and the different points associated with those on the website, that gives us an idea of what we might be expecting. I will say part of this is that for runoff, and we'll talk about this briefly, for atrazine, right, it relies also on runoff vulnerability. So for each county in Ohio, there are different relief points based on runoff vulnerability. For example, I believe in Pickaway County, there are 3 mitigation relief points because of where it falls in terms of runoff vulnerability. And in that case, these 3 runoff points for mitigation measures would be achieved. This is what this Bulletin's Live 2 output looks like. We see that for this specific product, there is no PULA or pesticide use limitation area within the state of Ohio. I did find a very small one in Tennessee, and I believe the restriction was that it couldn't be applied from September 15th to May 15th. Again, these products are going to receive these mitigation strategies as they work through the mitigation or the registration review process. Atrazine is one of those that we expect to be coming in the pipeline. The proposed label was released in December. Comments were due early February, and the EPA is in consultation with Fish and Wildlife and the National Marine Fisheries Services. Based on this timeline, we anticipate new labels for this on the market in 2027, with an annual application rate of 2 pounds and mitigation points required based on where you're located and the watersheds with predicted concentrations. So we see here on this map, right, we have a mix in Ohio of these green or these purple and blue areas, right? So these purple areas are watersheds with predicted concentrations of 9.7 to 45.4 micrograms per liter of atrazine. The blue areas then are the watersheds with predicted concentrations at or above 45.4 micrograms per liter, and depending on where you are, might require 3 to 6 mitigation points for application of atrazine. This is what that Bulletin's Live 2 system looks like. I suggest you use Google Chrome, seems to have the best functionality. This is also the link to get to this site. And a lot of these labels, as we saw on the Liberty Ultra label, suggest that we have to check this website at least 6 months in advance up to the day of application, right? And we have to type in the name of the pesticide, active ingredient. I guess one way I found to be effective is to just type in the EPA registration number so it has exactly the product you're looking for. And we can search in a couple different ways. It wants you to enter the application month. We can type in Ohio and look at different pesticide use limitation areas, or we can, look at different very granular parts of Ohio. We can type in an address or a county. And it shows you really geographically specific pesticide use limitations, right? So we can kind of zoom in and out to a map of selected areas of interest. And we can get really specific, right? You can type in an address and get the exact farm or location where this is going to be applied. So in summary for this portion, a final herbicide strategy was released, right? The strategy itself does not impose the requirements or restrictions on pesticide use. It's the framework that the EPA is going to use as it works through the herbicide registration and review process. Mitigation strategies will only become effective and put into place once we have EPA approval for a herbicide label, or if we have a new active ingredient registration, or it goes through the registration review. In any case, following this framework, right, we're going to have to rely on both the herbicide label as well as this Bulletin's Live 2 system. That being said, if internet access is a barrier for you, please reach out to our program or your local county extension educators, and we can find and help you get the resources needed for these sorts of applications. Did also want to mention dicamba and what's going on there, right? So registration was vacated in February 2024. The EPA did come back and put in an existing stocks order, which allowed us to apply those herbicides that had been purchased up to and through June 30th. Right, so as of this time, that was the last date for use in Ohio. Where we're applying dicamba products pre-emergence, right, those other dicamba products that are still labeled, in any soybean system, we now need to follow those cutoff deadlines per the label, same as we would in any other system. Right now, there are no dicamba products labeled for over-the-top use in soybean. The good news here, since the last registration challenge, right, we've seen a real shift to the Enlist technology. In our XtendFlex systems, we still have glufosinate post and PPO inhibitors in any soybean system. Timely applications and adequate environmental conditions are going to be increasingly important as we really rely on some of these contact type post herbicides. And along the same vein, right, our soil applied pre-emergence residual products are especially important for control. And then I want to briefly mention here in our last minute or so, this case for metribuzin in our water hemp control programs. Something we've been researching as a part of a larger team across the Midwest, and we've seen really great efficacy when it's included as a component in a tank mix, right? One of the issues that comes up is injury, of course, and so we've looked at this across many locations over many years, and the data really shows that we have minimal injury, none of which really influences yield at about that 10 to 12 ounce rate. And it really provides value here as a good tank mix option, again, to increase the diversity in our residual programs, especially as part of a robust pre-program, something like flumioxazin and pyroxasulfone with that metribuzin component. We have lots of resources. They can be somewhat hard to find. They're all listed on our website, which we have the link and QR code here. And you can, of course, always reach out to me at my email, find all of our resources on the website, including the multi-state weed control guide, and we can be found across all social media sites at Ohio State Weeds.
All right. Thanks, Alyssa. We did post the link to the your weeds website that has all those resources, and there's the links you just shared. You just go over to scroll over to the resources tab, and you can find all those links that Alyssa just shared with us.